Okay, the article I did was Sociolinguistic Labor, Linguistic Climate, and Racism on Campus, Black college students' experiences with language at predominantly white institutions, and the two authors and surveyors for this were Nicole Holliday and Lauren Squires. So the main issues that this targeted was linguistic racism at higher education institutions. So kind of focusing on how Black American students at those historically or predominantly white higher education settings, how their educational experiences were impacted by linguistic racism and the perceptions of their language by other people on campus. So the data was focused around 30 students, 19 of which were female. They were all self-identified as Black and or African American. They were all undergraduate students who were 18 plus, and they did have diversity as far as their hometowns, majors, positions held at the universities and colleges, etc. The places in which these surveys took place were two institutions. One was a large public selective Midwestern university, and 14 of the students came from there. This is a predominantly white institution, so most of the students are white still. And then the second one was a small, private, highly selective liberal arts college on the West Coast. This is a historically white institution with 60 of the respondents being from here. The historically white institution means that while it's no longer the majority of them are white, it started as that and was for a period of time. And then the mode of this research was done through 1-hour interviews. All the respondents were recruited through emails, contacts, and flyers. Holiday was at the bigger institution doing these interviews, and Squire was at the smaller one doing the interviews. And they really focused in on 20 questions within 4 categories, those categories being linguistic background, language use in the classroom, language use outside the classroom, and strategies for navigating the university. It's also important to note that language use outside the classroom is pertaining to environments such as rec centers, dining halls, still on campus, just not in an actual, academic setting necessarily. And then some other important information is that while they didn't directly ask about what this respondents felt, what dialects they spoke, they did ask them about code switching, if they knew what that was, if they used it, their feelings on it. And code switching was a really important part of this. And then also the students commonly reinforce the idea that all Black people aren't the same. So that's really important because this is only 30 students. This is not a survey of all Black people. This will not hold true for everybody, and every Black student is going to have a different experience and opinion. So just important to keep in mind. The first main finding was linguistic stereotyping and how it is indeed present on these institutional campuses. There's this thing called stereotype threat. So the stereotypes that are, associated with Black people then bleeds into their language and how that's perceived by others. There's this perceived lack of intelligence in connection with Black people. And while it's not true, it does have a very large effect on students and their willingness to participate in the community in the classroom. And so Black students have to be more careful about their language. They felt like they had to avoid their natural language in order to be taken seriously. And I thought that this was a really interesting, excerpt of one of the surveys because this student who's a Black woman is talking about how Black women are not stereotypically seen as smart. And this quote right here, the professor would ask a question, and I have to think before I raise my hand because I don't want to sound like that dumb Black girl or that dumb Black kid. So that's an example right there of how this stereotyping can directly impact the education of students, Black students. They're not getting involved in fear of being perceived a certain way, which is a hindrance to their education. So important note there. The second main finding was bifurcated sociolinguistic identities, so basically having multiple identities on these in these institutions. So these Black students had to maintain multiple codes, multiple identities for different spaces, which really ties into the idea of code switching. So where the students felt like they had to use a very standardized form of language in academic settings or around white people, and they described it as being able to take off the mask when they were around other Black people because they could talk more naturally and they didn't have to put up that wall of that super academic language that they were expected to do in the classroom. And it's really interesting because many of the students use the word mask and or facade. So I thought that was super interesting in relation to this and like those different identities. It kind of made me think like, of course, they have their own identity, and then they have this almost like forced identity to be successful in the classroom. And then that kind of ties into standardized language being seen as professional and how Black language isn't, and that's another reason why they kind of have to have this code switching in order to be successful in a way. And so we're talking about that here with this participant, talking about having a Black professor and feeling like you can kind of relax a little bit. And then like using this word game changer, talking about like having a classroom with other people of color and not having such like, having to hold that forced identity of like standardized English. The last main finding was that different campuses have different linguistic climates. The bigger university did have this kind of expectation of standardized English, the dropping of racial indicators, but the smaller college had this kind of idea of super standard English, and they had a high academic language for all, like a standard for high academic language for all students. So the students described as like big words, large words, longer sentences, and so even then when white students would use like this language as opposed to Black people, they'd be perceived better. One of the examples was along the lines of a white student saying like, let's continue or let's move on with this presentation, and the Black student said like, let's continue, and like even same message, they were perceived differently. And a really interesting part of this in the linguistic climate for the smaller college was that there was a tension between Black students because of linguistics and how like one group of the Black students would really lean into that super standard English and kind of strive to speak that way, and how like another group of Black students really wanted to embrace their natural way of speaking and not have to code switch so much. There was even tension between that, which I found really interesting. I had never considered before. So yeah, this is important, very important, because when these Black students have this linguistic hyper-awareness and they're always, being so intentional about the way they speak, and they're always having to code switch, there's that extra layer of effort that's, put onto the stress that they already have. It creates an extra barrier to their education, to their success, and to the way they're perceived. So it's, very important to think about that, especially as an educator. And then even in schools where there are diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, linguistic discrimination is often overlooked. They talked about this a little bit like in the background of this article, and how nobody really considers, that there's racial discrimination in language when we're talking about like racial discrimination on campuses. And so a lot of institutions don't put focus on that, and there needs to be. And I chose this article because I'm going to be a language educator, and I want to work in rural mid-Missouri communities, which will most likely be predominantly white. So I want to be very educated on linguistic racism and how that could potentially be an issue in places that I'll be going. So I just want to, hear the perspectives of Black students and learn more about this, so as an educator I can help combat it in every way I can. Thank you for listening.